to rave reviews and a sold-out theater. The modern dress production will again be directed by Tony Award winner Jamie Lloyd, whose reimagining of Andrew Lloyd Webber's Sunset Boulevard was named Best Musical Revival last season. Shakespeare with big stars has proven a good draw on Broadway. Denzel Washington and Jake Gyllenhaal led a record-breaking revival of Othello recently. No theater or opening date has been announced for Much Ado About Nothing. For NPR News, I'm Jeff London in New York.
A federal panel of President Trump's appointees has approved plans to build a large ballroom on the site of the former White House East Wing. The U.S. Commission of Fine Arts signed off on the design. The project would replace the East Wing, which Trump had demolished. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has filed a lawsuit in federal court to block construction. You're listening to NPR News from Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the Pew Charitable Trusts, sharing about the state of housing in America on the After the Fact podcast, available at pewtrusts.org/afterthefact, and the Doris Duke Foundation.
Support for The Middle comes from the Tyler Dickman Foundation, now matching your donations dollar for dollar for a limited time at listentothemiddle.com. Welcome to The Middle. I'm Jeremy Hobson. Our DJ Tolliver is here as well. And Tolliver, you and I are both millennials, which means that for most of our lives, we have been in the post-Cold War world order. In fact, do you even remember where you were when the Berlin Wall fell?
I believe I was teething, Jeremy.
Sure, come on. You're older than that. Well, I was probably watching TV, but it wasn't the news. It was probably Saved by the Bell or The Price is Right or something like that. But the reason I bring that up is that there was just this huge global security conference in Munich where a lot of people were talking about a new world order. And the question is whether this world order will mean the same transatlantic partnership that has existed since the end of World War II. As you know, the Trump administration has been very critical of NATO. But in Munich, the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said that alliance, NATO, is just as important in this new era.
In the era of great power rivalry, even the United States will not be powerful enough to go it alone.
Now, those comments came just about a month after President Trump threatened to use force, as you remember, to seize Greenland from Denmark, bringing NATO's very existence into question. The president has also said he wants to annex Canada, take back the Panama Canal, even take over Gaza. None of that has happened, but earlier this year, the U.S. did capture Venezuela's leader, Nicolas Maduro, and the president of the United States says the U.S. is now running that country. There is also, as we speak right now, a U.S. military buildup around Iran, and of course the global trade war with friends and foes alike. So a lot has happened in our foreign policy under President Trump in this last year, and we want to know what you think about it. So Tolliver, before I introduce our guests, how can our listeners reach us this hour?
Yeah, you can call us at 8444-MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. Or you can write to us at listentothemiddle.com or comment on our live stream on YouTube.
And joining us this hour, Nicholas Burns, the former U.S. ambassador to China and a professor of diplomacy and international relations at Harvard's Kennedy School. Ambassador, great to have you on the show.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Great to be with you.
And Ed Luce is also with us, chief U.S. commentator at the Financial Times. Ed, welcome back to The Middle.
It's a pleasure, Jeremy.
So, Ambassador Burns, let me start with you. I first met you when you were in the George W. Bush administration in the State Department. You were also, as we said, ambassador to China. That was under President Biden. You have served under Republican and Democratic presidents. What is your sense of this moment in American foreign policy?
I think this is a dangerous moment. I think it's a moment where the United States, the American people, have to choose: are we going to be in the world, working on big problems like climate change, global health, trying to end the threat of nuclear war, or are we going to go it alone? And, President Trump has done some things that have been positive. Ending the Gaza war was positive, and he was the author of that agreement. I think actually he was right last year to bomb the Iran nuclear sites to prevent the Iranians from achieving a nuclear weapon. But he's gone it alone. He's disavowed a lot of our allies. You said, Jeremy, he threatened Denmark with war. And no NATO leader has done that. No American president would have dreamed of doing that. the last 78 years. He's turned our allies away. He's broken the bond of trust with them. And he has not been sufficiently tough on Vladimir Putin for invading Ukraine and on Xi Jinping for a variety of problems that the Chinese are causing. So I'm worried that the United States has, in a way, lost its way in foreign policy.
Ed Luce, what do you think? And, the president would say when it comes to being tough on allies that he doesn't want America to be pushed around anymore. What do you think about the overall foreign policy right now?
So I was in Munich last week for the security conference, and the talk there was extremely different to anything I've ever encountered amongst America's allies, Europeans and Canadians, in my entire career. It wouldn't have been like this 3 months ago. But I think what had changed was what the French President Emmanuel Macron calls the Greenland moment. And the Greenland moment, of course, was when President Trump threatened sanctions on the European states, the 6 European states that had stood up with Denmark and Greenland to say, no, you can't take this by force. And Trump had then, in Davos, in Switzerland, in January, he'd taken the off-ramp on Greenland and said, okay, there is some kind of a deal here. It turned out to be a kabuki deal, but he took the off-ramp. But that was the moment where European leaders realized, well, if you stand up to him, then he backs down. But if you deal with him bilaterally, one-to-one, then America's so much larger that he will win, he will squash you. And I guess that sort of change really has changed the weather and the calculations. And so there's a sort of grittiness, there's a fearfulness about America under Trump doing another kind of Greenland moment, and whatever that might be, something random, something capricious, something not allied. But there's also an understanding that they're in it together now, and it's the rest of the West, if you like.
And Nick Burns, do you think that this is the kind of thing that if a new president of a different party comes in, then they come in and say, well, we're going, America's back. And, just as we've seen in the past, when the party that's in power changes, they say, okay, we're going to restore the way that people thought we were around the rest of the world? Or is this bigger? Is what Trump is doing going to be longer lasting even than his presidency?
I actually think it's both, Jeremy. It's a really good question. On the one hand, look at public opinion polls. The great majority of the American people support NATO. They believe that France and Germany and Britain are allies of the United States, and that Russia and China are not. But Trump has turned a lot of that in its head. As I said, he's been so critical of Europe on free speech. Well, one of the reasons why the Germans have hate speech laws is they don't want to see a Nazi party reappear the way it did 90 years ago. And he has been so much more critical of them, as has Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who spoke in Munich, than they are of the Russians and Chinese. This is a strange world. So in a way, no matter who we elect in 28, whether that's a Republican or a Democrat, I think the chances are that American president will look around and say, we need friends in the world. We need allies to contain Russian power in Europe, to limit what the Chinese are doing. And I think they will go back to NATO. And I think the Europeans, of course, will have no alternative but to say, okay, welcome back, if you will. We're going to stay in NATO, but welcome back to leadership. But it won't be the same because the American president threatened to invade a NATO ally. The American president, Donald Trump, has basically said that Canada doesn't have a right to exist. It's not sovereign. It should be our 51st state. Imagine that insult if you're a Canadian citizen. So I think it's going to be difficult to have full trust. And Ed, I think, eloquently has talked about why that's happened.
Well, and Ed, what about beyond sort of what the Trump administration is doing with allies? What about the intervention that we are seeing in Venezuela, where the U.S. now says it's running the country, it's controlling where the Venezuelan oil goes and where the money comes in, and as we speak right now, a buildup around Iran and a question of whether the United States is going to again attack Iran, maybe in a larger way than last year?
So the Venezuela operation, was, in military terms, a really impressive in, out, shoot the guys around Maduro and take him out without any loss of American life. It was a pretty sort of classic commando raid. And Trump, of course, watched it in that makeshift situation room in Mar-a-Lago, and he said, it was like watching TV, and it went pretty much seamlessly. Whether that means that Trump and Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, are running Venezuela, now that's quite a different matter, because the regime minus Maduro is in place. Now, they're permitted to sell more oil, and America has control of the revenues of that oil. Slightly unconventional arrangement where it's in some kind of account in Qatar in the Gulf, and no real sort of plan as to how it will be spent. But it's the same regime that Maduro headed, and so applying that to Iran. And I think there is the tendency of Trump likes these quick operations where there are no boots on the ground. And as Nick pointed out, he did a pretty brutally successful few days of bombing of Iran last summer. This is quite different, though, what he's talking about, which is unless the Iranians really cave, and they're very stubborn on the nuclear talks, unless they cave, then he's going to go for regime change. That's quite a different proposition than removing one guy and basically keeping the rest of the regime in place.
Well, just before we get to phone calls, Nick Burns, let me just ask you briefly, because Ed brought up the idea of this account in Qatar where they are, bringing the oil money from Venezuela through this account. What about the fact that so much of Trump's foreign policy also has to do with certain people, sometimes in his own family, benefiting financially from the deals that are being made?
Well, the allegations are serious and they ought to be looked into. And it's a kind of a brand of presidential power that we really haven't seen before. I just wanted to say in Venezuela that, it's one thing to rebuild the oil industry, and they should, because that's going to be the lifeblood of the Venezuelan economy. Mm-hmm. But Maria Corina Machado won the Nobel Prize. She's a Democratic leader. President Trump seems disinterested in supporting the small d Democratic Party, freedom-loving party in Venezuela. If we want stability in a very important country in our hemisphere, we should want that country to be democratic, not run by Maduro's henchmen.
But of course, the leader of that opposition party was the one who won the Nobel Peace Prize that the president is very interested in for himself, and actually I think has her prize at the moment. Tolliver, Canada, which we've talked about, one of the closest allies of the U.S., has been singled out by Trump, and the country's prime minister has said Canada needs to rely less on the U.S.
Yeah, and Canada has been looking to China for economic opportunities. Listen here to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney speaking on a recent visit to Beijing.
Mine is the first visit of a Canadian Prime Minister to China in nearly a decade. The world has changed much since that last visit. I believe the progress that we have made in the partnership sets us up well for the new world order.
Enthusiasm, wow.
A reminder that The Middle is available as a podcast. We're on Substack. Subscribe and listen to themiddle.com. Tolliver, what are we listening to here?
This is the Supremes with Stoned Love, which is an anti-Vietnam War song, but also begs the question, were the Supremes getting stoned? Because that would shock me a little bit. More of your calls coming up on The Middle.
Starting at 3 on KERA News.
Support for KERA News comes from the Dallas Symphony Orchestra presenting Brahms' Double Concerto featuring guest cellist Jan Vogler and guest violinist Chad Hoops. March 5th through 8th at the Meyerson. Tickets at DallasSymphony.org. AGB. You can download the MyAGB app to shop fresh departments like seafood, produce, bakery, deli, and even schedule curbside pickup or
by former U.S. Ambassador to China Nicholas Burns and Financial Times chief U.S. commentator Ed Luce. And before we get to the phones, Ambassador, as we said, you were the ambassador to China. How is China reacting to Trump's foreign policy?
I think China sees as an opportunity. China wants to divide Europe from the United States. But that's one of the reasons that they were happy to see these European leaders coming to Beijing. It also wants to weaken the United States. It's working with North Korea and with Russia to do just that. China's supplying most of the microelectronics that fuel the Russian war machine. North Korea's providing soldiers. And so in terms of the geopolitics of it, China wants to be number one eventually. They want to outpace us in the Indo-Pacific and eventually globally. This is an opportunity to do that. And if you listen to Xi Jinping, he represents China now as the responsible party protecting that global order that you talked about, Jeremy, at the beginning of the program. And he asserts that President Trump, with the tariffs, not working with anybody on climate change, is the irresponsible power. So they've taken advantage of this very cynically because, in my view, China's the big problem in the world in a lot of ways.
Well, and Ed Luce, we heard the Canadian Prime Minister saying he wants to sort of get closer with China. The United Kingdom is also doing a reset with China. Isn't that exactly the opposite of what the United States would want its allies to do?
Yes, and I think it's probably the opposite of what they originally would have liked to do. And I don't think, as you heard from the tone in Mark Carney's voice there, I don't think it was done with much enthusiasm. But Canada in particular, feeling that, the United States under Trump could do something drastic, up to and including, annexing Canada and supporting, by the way, the Alberta separatists. There have been several State Department meetings with separatists from Alberta. And Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, mentioned them quite sort of crudely in a TV interview. So that if you're Canada, well, then you're thinking, who else is big enough to help hedge my bets against this America gone rogue? And so they are all making the pilgrimage to Beijing just to try and sort of balance off a United States gone rogue with an opposite force.
Let's get to the phones. Janet is calling in from La Crosse, Wisconsin. Janet, what do you think of America's foreign policy under Trump?
Well, right now I am pretty disgusted with the policy and having a hard time even holding my head up as a USA citizen. It's not showing the whole country is not showing respect to our neighbors, to our allies, not at home, not abroad. That's my biggest message, is this total lack of respect that's being displayed, and which means he's not allowing others to make their own choice on their own future. I have a lot of family in Canada. I've been up there traveling. Yeah, I don't want to be the ugly American like we were some 20, 30, 40 years ago, and I'm not in this alone. We're all immigrants at some level and have left family behind in countries around the world. And right now I wouldn't want to travel to most of those countries. I'd be so embarrassed. I mean, the best that could happen is they would just shun me,
Yeah.
And I think this is going to last a